Big Shaq stops by McDonald's for a quick meal, expecting nothing unusual, until a terrified 6-year-old boy tugs at his sleeve and whispers, "Please don't leave. He's watching me." Shaq's instincts kick in as he notices a man in a dark hoodie watching them, too confident, too composed. Something is very, very wrong. As Shaq tries to uncover the truth without tipping off the stranger, he realizes time is running out. If he makes the wrong move, the boy could disappear forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq wasn't the type to get rattled easily. He had faced boardroom sharks, high-stakes deals, and people who thought money equaled power. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. It was just supposed to be a quick stop. Grab a burger, take a breather before his next meeting. He had parked his sleek black SUV outside, stepped into the warm, greasy scent of McDonald's, and ordered his usual. Nothing unusual. Just another day. But then he noticed the kid. The boy sat alone at a small table in the corner, hunched over a half-eaten burger, fingers gripping the edges of his tray. His clothes were slightly dirty, his hair messy like he hadn't been able to shower in days. His small hands trembled as he picked at his food, barely eating, his eyes darting around the room like he was waiting for something, or someone. Shaq had seen enough in life to know when something was off. This was off. He watched a little longer, subtly scanning the room. The McDonald's was busy, filled with families, students, and office workers grabbing late lunches. Nobody seemed to notice the kid. Nobody except Shaq. As he finished his meal and stood to toss his tray, the boy moved fast. A tiny, shaking hand grabbed his sleeve, clutching the thick fabric of his designer hoodie. Shaq stopped cold. Then came the whisper. So soft, so desperate, it barely reached him. "Please don't leave. He's watching me." Shaq's heart slammed against his ribs. Who? He followed the kid's terrified gaze across the room, straight to a man sitting in the farthest booth. The man looked ordinary, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a gray button-up and slacks, a half-empty coffee cup in front of him. But his eyes, those eyes were wrong. They weren't the eyes of someone casually having a meal. They were focused, calculating, watching. Not watching Shaq. Watching the boy. Shaq's instincts kicked into high gear. This wasn't right. This wasn't a father and son, or an uncle babysitting. This was something else. The man noticed Shaq looking at him. He gave a slow, polite smile. Too polite. Then, just as smoothly, he picked up his phone and started texting. Shaq's pulse spiked. The boy still clung to his sleeve, his grip tightening. He looked ready to cry, but no tears came. He had probably learned crying doesn't help. Shaq crouched down slightly to meet his eyes. "What's your name, kid?" The boy hesitated. His lip trembled. Then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, I don't know." Shaq's blood ran cold. Shaq straightened up, his muscles tense. This was no ordinary situation. The man across the room was still pretending not to watch, but his fingers moved fast on his phone. Who was he messaging? Another accomplice? A getaway car waiting outside? Shaq knew he had seconds to decide. He could just walk away, call the cops, let someone else handle it, or number. Shaq had spent his life refusing to ignore things that didn't sit right. He wasn't about to start now. He turned back to the kid, voice calm but firm. "You're not going anywhere with him." The boy's breath hitched. He nodded, just barely. Shaq took a step toward the counter, keeping himself between the man and the kid. His fingers brushed against his phone in his pocket, ready to dial 911. That's when the man stood up, calm, collected. But Shaq could see the shift, the frustration, the calculation, the realization that his plan just got ruined. He walked toward them, setting his coffee cup down on the nearest table. And then with an oily smile, he said, "Hey, buddy, ready to go?" Shaq didn't move. "The kid's not going anywhere with you." The man chuckled lightly, looking Shaq up and down like he was just another obstacle. "Relax, man. I'm his uncle, just picking him up. Right, Jake?" Shaq turned slightly, locking eyes with the boy. His face was pale. He looked like he was trying to shrink into himself. And that's when Shaq knew. His name wasn't Jake. The man had slipped up. Shaq's jaw tightened. His voice dropped an octave. If you're his uncle, then you won't mind telling me his full name. A flicker of irritation crossed the man's face, but he recovered quickly. Jake Matthews. Come on, kid, we don't have all day. The boy flinched. Shaq felt his stomach turn. That was the wrong name. The man wasn't just lying. He was used to lying. This wasn't his first time. Shaq glanced at the entrance. Where was security? Where were the employees? The restaurant was still buzzing with life, yet no one else saw what was happening. It was happening right in front of them, and still, no one noticed. How many kids had this man walked out of places just like this, without anyone stopping him? The thought made Shaq's hands clench into fists. The man sighed dramatically as if Shaq was just an annoying inconvenience. All right, look, I don't have time for this. I don't know who you think you are, but I don't need some stranger telling me what I can and can't do. The kid's coming with me, so step aside. He reached for the boy's arm, and Shaq moved. He didn't grab the man, didn't push him, but he shifted, blocking the kid completely. It was a message, a silent one. Try it. See what happens. The man's mask slipped for just a second. Shaq saw the anger there, the irritation of a predator denied his prey. But then, the door swung open, and sirens blared outside. The man's entire demeanor changed. His face twisted for a millisecond. Then he smiled again. But this time it was forced. Guess we'll have to continue this another time, he muttered. And just like that, he turned and walked toward the exit. Shaq's mind raced. Should he grab him? Hold him down? But before he could act, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The man hesitated. He knew. He turned back to Shaq, eyes cold. You shouldn't have gotten involved. Shaq's expression didn't change. You shouldn't have either. And then, the cops moved in. As the officers restrained the man, Shaq felt the boy clutch his hoodie again. This time, not in fear, but in relief. One of the cops turned to Shaq. You're the one who called? Shaq nodded once. The officer sighed. Good thing you did. This guy's been on our radar for a while, suspected in multiple child abduction cases. But we never caught him in the act. Shaq's jaw clenched. How many kids had already been lost? The boy's small voice trembled. My name's not Jake. Shaq looked down at him, heart heavy. I know, kid. As the police took the predator away, Shaq finally let out a slow breath. He had stepped into McDonald's for a simple meal, but he had just saved a life. And as he watched the boy reunite with his crying mother minutes later, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes power isn't about money. It's about knowing when to use it. Shaq crouched down to the boy's level, keeping his voice calm, steady. Who's watching you? The kid hesitated, eyes darting toward a booth in the corner. Shaq followed his gaze and locked onto a man in a dark hoodie, sitting with his back half turned, pretending to scroll through his phone. But Shaq knew better. That wasn't casual. That was staged. The man wasn't just scrolling. He was watching, listening, waiting. The boy swallowed hard, his tiny fingers still gripping Shaq's sleeve like a lifeline. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I can't talk. He said he'd hurt my mom. Shaq's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a lost kid. This was something else. Something dangerous. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had to get this right. He exhaled slowly, keeping his posture relaxed. No sudden movements. No panic. If he spooked the guy in the hoodie, things could spiral fast. Shaq's mind raced. Calling 911 outright might tip the man off, if he was dangerous. And everything about him screamed danger. He could grab the kid and bolt before help arrived. Shaq needed a plan. Fast. The McDonald's buzzed with normalcy. Cash registers chimed. Kids laughed at the play place. Fries sizzled in the back. But Shaq felt the tension under it all. He took another glance at the man in the hoodie. Still there. Still watching. But now the guy knew Shaq had noticed him. Shaq could see the subtle shift, the tightening of his grip on his phone, the way his jaw clenched just slightly. He wasn't just some guy on his lunch break. He was a predator caught in the act. Shaq leaned in, keeping his tone gentle but firm. "Okay, buddy, I got you. But you have to trust me, all right?" The boy gave the tiniest nod. Shaq turned slightly, keeping one hand on the table, his body language casual. The man was watching. Shaq needed him to think nothing was happening. He pulled out his phone and acted like he was checking messages. Instead, he opened his camera and snapped a picture, quick, precise, before smoothly switching to his notes app. His fingers moved fast. 9/11. Possible child abduction. McDonald's on 5th and Park, man in hoodie, sitting alone. He copied the message, switched to his contacts, and pasted it into a text for his head of security. Shaq's security team wasn't just for show. They were ex-military, ex-law enforcement, trained to handle situations exactly like this. He hit send. The net was closing in. Before Shaq could breathe, the man in the hoodie stood up. Shaq's pulse spiked. The guy was tall, lean, built like someone used to getting what he wanted without much of a fight. He adjusted his sleeves, rolled his neck, and took a slow step forward. Then another. He was coming straight for them. Shaq didn't move. He needed to see how this guy played it. The man stopped at the edge of the table, smiling, but it wasn't real. It was forced. Too smooth. "Hey, little man," the guy said, his voice calm, too casual. "Time to go." Shaq kept his expression unreadable, waiting, calculating. The boy shrank back against Shaq's leg, his breathing shallow. Shaq felt the anger rise, but he pushed it down. This was a game of patience now. The man turned his gaze to Shaq, sizing him up. "Appreciate you keeping an eye on him," the guy continued. "His mom asked me to grab him, but you know how kids are. Always running off." Shaq smiled, just a little, letting him think he still had control. "Oh yeah?" he said smoothly. "What's his name?" Silence. It was barely a second, but it was long enough. The man's face didn't change, but Shaq saw it, the flicker of irritation, the miscalculation. Then, just as quickly, he covered. "Jason," he said, flashing an easy grin. Shaq didn't blink. Wrong answer. He turned back to the boy, crouching slightly. "Hey, buddy," he said, voice gentle. "Is your name Jason?" The boy's eyes darted to the man, then back to Shaq. He hesitated. And that hesitation was everything. Shaq's jaw tightened. He stood, towering over the man, his presence alone enough to make people step back. "That's funny," Shaq said lightly, "because earlier, he told me he doesn't know his name." The man's smile wavered. And then, for the first time, Shaq saw it, the crack in his confidence. The realization that he wasn't in control anymore. The man exhaled sharply, forcing another smile. "Listen, man, I don't have time for this. We need to go." Shaq didn't move, and then, just as he expected, the man reached for the boy. It was too fast, too practiced, like he had done this before. But Shaq was faster. He stepped between them, blocking the man completely. The guy's mask dropped, just for a second. A flash of frustration, a sliver of panic. "Look, dude," the man snapped. "I don't know who you think you are, but..." Shaq cut him off, his voice low, dangerous. "I think I'm the reason you're not walking out of here with him." And then, right on cue, the front doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. The man stiffened. Shaq didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. And for the first time, the man knew he had lost. The officers moved in fast. "Sir, we need you to step aside," one of them said to Shaq. He nodded, lifting his hand slightly. "He's all yours." The man took a step back, palms up, playing innocent. "Whoa, hold on. This is a misunderstanding." One of the officers was already pulling out a photo on his phone. Shaq saw it before the guy did. A wanted poster. The officer's eyes hardened. "Your name isn't Jason either, is it?" The man bolted, or at least he tried to. He barely made it 3 steps before the cops took him down. Shaq exhaled slowly. The boy, still clutching Shaq's sleeve, let out a tiny, broken sob. Shaq looked down at him and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, kid," he said, voice softer now. "You're safe." The boy didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His grip on Shaq's hoodie loosened. and for the first time, Shaq felt him breathe. The cops secured the suspect, escorting him out. Another officer crouched near the boy. "Hey, buddy, we're gonna find your mom, okay?" Shaq stayed put, making sure the kid wasn't alone. People around the restaurant were finally starting to notice, whispering, watching. But none of them had seen what almost happened. None of them had heard the whisper that started it all. As Shaq sat back down, still watching the boy, one thought burned in his mind. How many times had this happened before? And how many times had no one listened? Shaq sat perfectly still, his mind working in overdrive. He had to play this right. The man in the hoodie was watching, closely. One wrong move and this could go south fast. Shaq slid his phone out of his pocket, keeping it low under the table. His fingers moved swiftly, navigating to his messages without looking down. 9/11. Possible child abduction. McDonald's on 5th and Park, man in black hoodie, approaching now. He hit send. But that was just step one. Now he had to buy time. If the man suspected anything, he might grab the kid and bolt. Or worse. Shaq kept his voice light, easy, casual. "So, little man," he said, turning to the boy with a big grin. "What's your go-to McDonald's meal? Nuggets? Big Mac?" The kid hesitated, his fingers still gripping Shaq's hoodie like a lifeline. Shaq kept his expression open, warm, trying to make the kid feel safe enough to play along. Finally, after a long, shaky breath, the boy whispered, "Fries." Shaq's grin widened. "Good choice. You gotta do 'em with extra salt, though. That's the trick." The boy gave the tiniest nod, but his eyes flickered toward the man in the hoodie. Shaq noticed, and so did the predator. The man stood up. Shaq felt the shift in the air like a silent alarm. The predator had realized something wasn't right. Shaq didn't move, didn't react. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay relaxed, shoulders loose. No sudden movements. The man walked toward them, his steps slow, deliberate, calculated. Shaq sized him up again. He didn't panic. That meant one of two things. He thought he was still in control. He had a backup plan. Neither option was good. The man stopped just beside the table. He gave Shaq a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, bud," the man said, ignoring Shaq completely. "We gotta go." Shaq watched the boy's whole body tense. He didn't move. The man's jaw twitched. He was expecting obedience, blind compliance. And when he didn't get it, his patience cracked. Just a little. "Come on, Jake," the man said, sharper this time. Shaq's stomach tightened. He already knew. The kid's name wasn't Jake. Shaq leaned back, stretching his arms across the seat, blocking the kid in just enough. He kept his voice smooth, casual, like he wasn't challenging the man at all. "Oh yeah?" Shaq said, raising an eyebrow. "So how do you two know each other?" The man's eyes flickered, just for a second. Shaq caught it. A tiny hesitation. Then, the fake smile returned. "I'm his uncle." Shaq let the words hang between them. Then he turned to the kid. "That true, little man?" The kid looked frozen, his small hands gripping the table. Shaq saw the truth written all over his face. The man saw it too. And he didn't like it. The man's smile disappeared, replaced by something colder. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I don't have time for this. The kid's coming with me." Shaq tilted his head like he was considering it. Then, he dropped the bomb. "That's funny," Shaq said, his voice quiet but firm. "Because I just texted 911. The man froze. And that's when everything changed. The man's reaction wasn't anger. It was calculation. His eyes darted toward the exit, toward the other customers, toward the counter, measuring his options. Shaq saw it before he even moved. He was going to run. Shaq's grip tightened under the table. If the guy got away now, they might never find him again. Shaq needed to stall. Just a few more seconds. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough so only the man could hear. "You don't want to do this." The man's fists clenched. Shaq kept going. "Maybe this was a mistake," he said. "Maybe you just got mixed up in something bad. But if you run," he shrugged, "then you're guilty. It was a gamble, and Shaq saw it land. The man hesitated, a fraction of a second. But it was enough, because just then, the front doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, scanning the room. Shaq saw the moment the man realized it was over. The tight grip on his phone, the barely contained panic. He glanced toward the back exit, and then he bolted. Shaq was ready. Before the man could take 2 full steps, Shaq pushed back from the table, his sheer presence alone enough to knock the chair into his path. The man stumbled. That split-second delay was all the cops needed. Freeze! The man barely had time to turn before they tackled him to the ground. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs. And in the middle of it all, the little boy, still frozen in place. Shaq crouched beside him, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey," Shaq said, voice steady. "You're safe now." For the first time, the kid exhaled. The cops hauled the man to his feet, slapping cuffs on his wrists. One officer walked over, nodding at Shaq. "We've been looking for this guy for months," he said. "You just stopped something real bad from happening." Shaq didn't feel like celebrating, because the truth settled into his bones with a sickening weight. How many other times had this guy gotten away with it? The kid clung to Shaq's sleeve. "What happens now?" Shaq met his eyes, his jaw tightening. "Now," Shaq said, "we make sure this never happens again." The cops took statements. The suspect was dragged out in cuffs. Shaq stayed with the boy until his mother arrived, a woman who had been searching for her son in a panic, tears streaming down her face. She thanked Shaq over and over, sobbing as she hugged her son. But Shaq barely heard her. He kept thinking about one thing. What if he hadn't stopped at McDonald's that day? How many people had walked past that kid before Shaq did? How many had ignored the signs? And how many more kids were out there, trapped in plain sight, just waiting for someone to notice? Shaq kept his expression neutral, but every muscle in his body was tense. The man stood over their table, his presence heavy, his voice coated in false warmth. "Hey, buddy," the man said to the boy, forcing a smile. "Time to go." The kid flinched, barely noticeable, but Shaq saw it. Fear. Shaq didn't move. He leaned back in his seat, slow and deliberate, crossing his arms like he had all the time in the world. "Didn't look like he was ready to leave," Shaq said, his voice casual but firm. The man's fake smile didn't fade, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of calculation. Shaq could feel the kid's tiny fingers gripping his sleeve under the table. He wasn't just scared. He was begging Shaq not to let go. Shaq's heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he kept his tone light. "You his dad?" The man hesitated. Too long. "Uncle," he corrected smoothly. "His mom asked me to pick him up." Shaq nodded slowly. He let the silence stretch, a business tactic he'd used in high-stakes negotiations. People rush to fill silence, and liars trip over their own words. Sure enough, the man kept talking. "She had an emergency. Told me to grab him some food before we headed out." Shaq tilted his head, studying him. This guy was good. Too good. "Funny," Shaq said. "Because when I asked the kid earlier, he said his favorite food was fries." The man blinked. "Yeah, so..." Shaq's smile was slow. Cold. "You didn't order him anything." For the first time, the man faltered. A small crack in the act. Shaq knew that look. It was the look of someone realizing their carefully built lie was coming apart. The man's jaw clenched, but he recovered quickly. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't your business," he said, shifting his weight. Shaq glanced at the boy. He still hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. Shaq wasn't going to let him go with this man, not a chance. But he also knew he had to be smart. If this guy bolted now, they might not catch him. And if he got away the next time, the kid might not be so lucky. Shaq needed one more piece of leverage. "All right," Shaq said, leaning back like he was conceding. "I get it. Family stuff." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, thinking he'd won. Shaq picked up his phone, making a show of scrolling. The cops had to be close by now. But before he could stall any longer, the man made his move. "Come on, kid," the man said, reaching down. "Let's go." The boy shrank back. Shaq saw real terror flash across his face. And that was it. Shaq blocked the man's hand with his arm. "Whoa," Shaq said, his tone still light, but now there was steel beneath it. "Let's ask the kid, yeah?" The man's mask cracked completely. His smile vanished, and for the first time he stopped pretending. "You don't want to do this," the man said quietly. Shaq met his gaze, unwavering. "Yeah? Pretty sure I do." The man's hands clenched into fists. For the first time, Shaq felt the real threat in the air. This guy wasn't just some random creep. He was used to getting his way, and he didn't like being challenged. Tension thickened around them. Customers kept eating, completely unaware that a battle was happening just a few feet away. Shaq's mind worked fast. If this guy was really desperate, he might grab the kid and run. Shaq needed to keep him distracted, keep him in one place. So he played his next card. "You sure you want to do this here?" Shaq said, raising an eyebrow. "With security cameras watching?" For the first time, the man glanced toward the ceiling. Shaq saw it happen, the doubt creeping in. That was all he needed. Because at that exact moment, the McDonald's doors burst open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their eyes immediately scanning the restaurant. The man's face drained of color. Shaq grinned. "Gotcha." The man turned, too fast, too desperate, and that's when the cops spotted him. "You!" one of them shouted. "Don't move!" The man didn't listen. He bolted. Shaq had expected this. As the man turned to run, Shaq pushed back his chair, hard. The chair skidded into the man's legs, tripping him. He stumbled forward, right into the path of the cops. Bam! One officer tackled him, slamming him down. The other grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. Customers finally started to realize something was happening. Gasps. A few screams. And in the middle of it all, Shaq looked at the kid, still frozen in place, still shaking, but safe. Shaq crouched beside him. "You okay, little man?" The kid nodded. For the first time, his grip loosened on Shaq's sleeve. And Shaq knew they had won. The cops dragged the man to his feet. Shaq saw his whole demeanor change. No more fake smiles, no more smooth talking, just anger. "You don't know who you're messing with," the man spat. Shaq didn't even blink. "Neither did you," Shaq said, his voice low. One of the officers turned to Shaq. "We've been after this guy for months," he said. "You might have just saved more than one kid today." Shaq's stomach turned. How many others had this guy hurt? How many people had just walked past before Shaq showed up? As the cops led the man away, Shaq looked down at the kid again. His small frame, his wide, fearful eyes. This kid had almost disappeared, and no one would have even noticed. Shaq clenched his jaw. How many more were out there, right now, waiting for someone to notice? The kid whispered something. Shaq leaned in. "Thank you," the boy said. Shaq swallowed hard. Then he did something he never did. He hugged the kid back, and silently promised himself he'd never ignore a whisper for help again. Shaq knew how to handle pressure. He had dealt with billion-dollar negotiations, high-stakes business rivalries, and people who would do anything to stay in control. But this was different. This wasn't about money, contracts, or corporate battles. This was about a child's life. And right now, that child was trapped in a game of silent warfare between Shaq and a man who had everything to lose. Shaq kept his expression calm, leaning forward slightly. He had to keep the man distracted, keep him talking, keep him from running. "So," Shaq said casually, acting as if they were discussing the weather, "you and your nephew must be close." The man's fingers twitched slightly, his mask cracking just a bit. "Of course," the man replied, but his voice was forced. "He's family." Shaq nodded, playing along. "What's his favorite movie?" A single second of hesitation. The man's jaw tightened. "What?" Shaq shrugged. "You know, every kid's got a favorite movie. When I was little, I must have watched The Lion King 100 times. He glanced down at the boy. "Bet you've got one too, huh?" The boy's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but fear held him back. The man's grip on the table edge tightened. "We don't have time for this," That was it. That slip. That little moment of panic. This man wasn't some loving uncle in a rush. He was someone on a deadline. Someone who had a plan and was running out of time. Shaq's fingers hovered over his phone. He had already sent the text to 911, but so far, no response. He needed to buy just a few more minutes. He exhaled, shifting his weight in his seat. Hey, relax, man. No need to rush the kid. His voice was smooth, controlled, carefully calculated. The man stared at him for a long beat. Assessing, calculating. Then his gaze flicked toward Shaq's phone. Did he see the message? Shaq's grip tightened. He couldn't let this guy bolt. Not yet. But then, a sound in the distance. Sirens. Faint, but growing louder. The man heard them too, and his entire demeanor changed. It happened fast. Too fast. The man's face darkened. His hand darted out, gripping the boy's wrist. The boy yelped in panic. Shaq's pulse spiked. This was it. The moment where everything could go terribly, horribly wrong. The man started to stand, yanking the boy with him. Shaq moved without thinking. Not aggression, not violence, just a block. He placed his hand on the table's edge, just enough to cut off the man's direct path to the door. A subtle move. A warning. The man's breath hitched. His eyes flicked toward Shaq's broad shoulders, finally registering the full extent of the obstacle in his way. Shaq's voice dropped. Low. Dangerous. Unshakable. Let go. A single second of pure tension. Then, the doors burst open. 2 uniformed officers rushed in, hands on their holsters, eyes scanning the restaurant. Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't break eye contact with the man, because he needed him to know. It was over. The man let go of the boy's wrist, but then, in a final act of desperation, he bolted. Shaq was ready. He shifted just slightly, sending a chair tumbling into the man's path. The man stumbled. It was enough. The officers were on him in seconds. A crash. A struggle. The clink of handcuffs snapping shut. It was over. The entire restaurant was silent. McDonald's workers stood frozen behind the counter. Customers gripped their drinks and fries, wide-eyed and shaken. The little boy sat motionless, his hands still trembling on the table. Shaq turned toward him, crouching slightly so they were eye level. Hey, Shaq said softly. You okay? The boy nodded. But Shaq knew. This wasn't over for him. Not yet. A female officer approached, her expression tight. We've been tracking this guy for months, she said, nodding toward the man now being dragged outside in cuffs. You just saved that kid's life. Shaq exhaled slowly. But his mind wouldn't let go of one thought. What if he hadn't stopped at McDonald's that day? How many people had walked past this kid before Shaq noticed? How many other kids were out there, sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to care? Shaq stood up, watching as the officers led the man toward their squad car. The little boy's mother burst through the doors, eyes wild with panic. The boy ran to her. She fell to her knees, wrapping him in her arms, sobbing. Shaq's chest tightened. He'd won this round. But how many more battles like this were still happening? Unseen. Shaq stepped outside, inhaling the cool evening air. His phone buzzed. A business email. A deal waiting to be signed. But for once, he ignored it. Because right now there was only one thing on his mind. How many more are out there? Waiting. Hoping. Praying someone will notice them before it's too late. The McDonald's suddenly felt smaller. The air was thick, charged with tension. Shaq stood slowly, rising to his full height, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the man, blocking his exit. The man stiffened, his entire demeanor shifting. His confidence cracked, just for a second, just long enough for Shaq to see it. But then, the mask slipped back on. The man let out a forced chuckle, holding up his hands in fake innocence. Relax, big guy, he said smoothly. We're just leaving. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. He just stared the man down, his voice low and steady. Nah, Shaq said. You're staying right here. A heavy silence fell over the restaurant. The man's fingers twitched. His eyes darted to the door, to the growing sound of sirens. He knew. His time was up. Still, He wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Look, man, the guy tried again, forcing a laugh. I don't know what you think is happening here, but… Shaq took a step forward. The man immediately took 2 steps back. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it told Shaq everything he needed to know. This man… He was scared, not of Shaq's size, not even of getting caught. He was scared of losing control, and right now, he had none. Shaq's eyes flickered to the boy. He was still seated, his small hands gripping the table, his face pale with fear. Shaq's stomach twisted. He had to keep the man here, had to keep him from running. So he did what he did best. He played the long game. Shaq crossed his arms, tilting his head like he was just mildly curious. Let me ask you something, he said, his voice smooth. How dumb do you think I am? The man blinked, caught off guard. What? Shaq smirked. I mean, really, you think I can't see what's going on here? A flicker of something dangerous crossed the man's face. Shaq pushed harder. You told me his name is Jake, Shaq said, his voice dropping lower. Silence. You hesitated when I asked how you know him. The man's jaw tightened. And the kid? Shaq nodded toward him. Hasn't said a single word in your defense. The man's breathing quickened. Shaq stepped forward again. Now tell me, how does that look? The man snapped. His eyes darkened, his entire body tensing as he hissed through clenched teeth. You need to back off. Shaq leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a whisper. Or what? The sirens were loud now. Flashing lights filled the McDonald's parking lot, reflecting off the windows. The man swallowed hard, his entire body coiled like a cornered animal. Shaq saw it before it happened. The decision. The fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. Then, the front doors burst open. 2 uniformed officers stormed inside, hands hovering over their holsters. Freeze! One of them shouted. The entire restaurant gasped. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact with the man, because he needed him to know. It was over. For a split second, the man seemed frozen in time. His hands twitched at his sides. His eyes darted to the exit, to the officers, to Shaq. Then, he moved. But Shaq was faster. Not violent, not reckless, just precise. As the man lunged, Shaq shifted his stance, knocking a chair into his path. The man stumbled. That fraction of a second delay was all the cops needed. They tackled him, slamming him against the floor as the restaurant erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs. And in the middle of it all, the little boy, still frozen in place. Shaq crouched beside him, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. Hey, Shaq said, his voice steady. You're safe now. For the first time, the kid exhaled. The officers hauled the man up, cuffing him as he thrashed and shouted. One officer turned to Shaq, nodding in recognition. We've been looking for this guy, he said. You just stopped something real bad from happening. Shaq didn't respond right away. He looked down at the boy, at the way his small hands were still trembling, at the way his chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. He'd won this round. But how many others had already been lost? The question that wouldn't leave him. Minutes later, a woman burst into the McDonald's. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wild with panic. She barely made it 2 steps before the boy ran to her, sobbing as she dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms. Shaq watched, his chest tightening. The mother thanked him over and over, but Shaq barely heard her, because one thought kept repeating in his mind. What if he hadn't stopped at McDonald's that day? How many people had walked past that kid before Shaq noticed? How many more kids were out there, trapped in plain sight, waiting, hoping, praying that someone will notice them before it's too late? The chaos had died down, but the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Shaq stood near the entrance, his pulse still steady, but his mind racing. The reality of what had just happened was settling in. The man, the predator, was now in cuffs, being dragged toward the squad car outside. His face twisted in anger, but there was no fight left in him. He had lost. But Shaq wasn't focused on him anymore. His eyes were on the little boy, still standing beside his mother, who had collapsed onto the floor, clutching him so tightly as if she was afraid to ever let go. Her sobs filled the restaurant. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered over and over, "I thought I lost you. I thought I lost you forever." The boy, small, fragile, and no longer silent, held on to her just as tightly. One of the officers, a hardened detective with sharp eyes, approached Shaq. "You did a good thing today," he said, nodding toward the child. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his face. His adrenaline was finally wearing off. "What's his story?" Shaq asked, his voice quieter now. The officer's expression darkened. He glanced at the boy and his mother before sighing. "His mom's been searching for him for weeks," the officer said. "She reported him missing, but there were no leads, no ransom, no demands." He paused, glancing toward the man in cuffs. "We think he was being used as leverage." Shaq's jaw clenched. "For what?" The officer hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "His mother. She's a single parent. No resources, no connections. We think this guy," he nodded toward the trafficker, "was part of a bigger operation. They use kids to control their parents, force them into things, silence them." Shaq's stomach turned. It wasn't just a random abduction. It was a system, a twisted, calculated method of keeping desperate people in check. Shaq inhaled deeply, his hands tightening into fists. This wasn't just about this kid. How many more were out there? Shaq turned his gaze back to the little boy, now wiping his tears as his mother whispered into his ear, stroking his hair. Despite everything, he was safe now. Shaq walked toward them, stopping a few feet away. The mother noticed him first, looking up with red, swollen eyes filled with gratitude. She struggled to find the words. She started, but her voice broke. Shaq shook his head. "You don't have to say anything." But she did anyway. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my son's life." Shaq looked at the little boy, whose wide, tired eyes finally met his. Shaq crouched down, resting his hands on his knees so he was at eye level. "You're safe now, kid," Shaq said gently. The boy hesitated. Then for the first time, he spoke without fear. "Thank you." The two simple words hit Shaq harder than he expected. He felt something shift in his chest, a realization. This wasn't just a one-time incident. This was a wake-up call. As Shaq straightened up, he glanced around the McDonald's. People were still watching. Workers stood frozen behind the counter. Customers sat at their tables, whispering, shaken. How many of them had noticed something was off, but said nothing? How many people walked past that little boy today, or yesterday, or the day before that, and ignored him? How many other kids were sitting in places just like this, waiting for someone to notice? Shaq had power, money, influence, a voice people listened to. And for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. He turned to the officer. "I want to help," Shaq said. The officer studied him, then nodded slowly. "We'll be in touch." As Shaq stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a reset button. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the pavement. The predator was being shoved into the back of the squad car, his face tight with anger, but it didn't matter. He was done. Shaq looked up at the night sky, taking a deep breath. Then, without another word, he walked away. But this time, he wasn't just walking away from McDonald's. He was walking towards something bigger, a fight worth taking on. Because tonight, one child was saved. But tomorrow, there would be another, and Shaq wasn't going to ignore it. Every day, children like him go unnoticed, trapped in plain sight, waiting for someone to care. Today, Shaq listened. But how many others are still out there, hoping for the same? Stay aware. Speak up. You could be the difference between a life saved and a life lost. If this story moved you, share it, spread awareness, and join us in protecting those who can't protect themselves. Because sometimes, the smallest whisper is the loudest cry for help. Will you be the one to listen?